Scientific advances over the last 150 years have made our modern world an incredible place. Technology lets us live longer, healthier, and more connected lives.
Technology is completely vital to the way we live.
Canada is a nation of imagination and innovation. Canadians have played a massive role in developing many of the world's most significant medical and technological breakthroughs.
We've really changed the face of the planet with our innovation.
Imagine Canada's best innovations, boom, just stopped working.
To see just how much Canada has impacted the world, we're going to look at it through a different lens. Today, some of Canada's game-changing innovations will cease to function.
He would never have been president. We might never have gone to the moon.
What would we do? What kind of a world would we live in?
There wouldn't be a person on Earth who wasn't affected.
People are going to be dropping in the streets. It's going to be absolutely chaotic.
A world without Canada really wouldn't be much of a world at all.
Join us in our thought experiment. Over the next hour, we'll show you the devastating place that would be the world without Canada. It's a day unlike any other on planet Earth. More than 7 billion people are unaware that the world will suddenly be left without Canada's game-changing contributions to science and technology.
Without the ability to communicate and share information, the world would very quickly descend into chaos, not over days, not over months, in hours.
A nation of great distances, Canada is one of the world's most inventive countries in communications breakthroughs.
Since the dawn of time, distance had been the defining characteristic. The farther away somebody actually was from you, the less well-connected you were. Simple as that. Telephony, telecommunications took that away. It made everybody exactly one phone call away from everybody else.
The world can thank Alexander Graham Bell, a Canadian, for the telephone.
Bell moved to Canada with his family when he was 23 years old.
Bell had a natural passion for communication and audio and sound, and he put that knowledge to use when he was developing the telephone. And actually, his first tests were done in Brantford, Ontario, which is still known as the Telephone City.
Bell's early telephone used a liquid transmitter that converted vibrations from his voice into electrical signals. The liquid was dilute sulfuric acid. According to legend, the famous first call between Bell and Watson was actually a response to Bell spilling some acid on his trousers. A patent was issued to Bell on March 7, 1876 for his telephone. While other inventors were closing in with similar inventions, the world would not be the same if Bell had not been the first to the patent.
If he had failed to get that protection for his intellectual property, would he have felt motivated to go on to the other great inventions?
Securing the telephone patent ensured Bell could fund further inventions, many of them envisioned at his home in Baddeck, Nova Scotia. Bell helped refine the phonograph, developed the hydrofoil, and worked on airplane designs. He also came up with something called the photophone, which is the basis for fiber optic technology.
Endless inventions all would have disappeared if he hadn't successfully created and protected his intellectual property here in Canada.
Bell's telephone was the start of a global transformation, not just for himself, but for communications worldwide.
This is the biggest invention of communication since writing. Could you imagine solving an international crisis with letters? It can mean the difference between war and peace.
Even an indirect telephone connection can present complications. It wasn't until 1968 that most international phone calls could be made without an appointment and an operator. The Cuban Missile Crisis emphasized the importance of a direct telephone connection.
The single most important telephone connection in the world is the one between the White House and the Kremlin. The one that was put in after the Cuban Missile Crisis that said, look, we cannot let a misunderstanding escalate to the point of global thermonuclear war.
Only a few years after we could easily phone other countries, American President Richard Nixon made the farthest long-distance phone call in history to the Apollo 11 mission.
His voice made that historic phone call from the White House. He called Neil and Buzz on the moon on July 20th, 1969.
And Canadians continued to trailblaze in telephone technologies.
We got to see it start in Brantford, Ontario, with Alexander Graham Bell going to smartphones at Research in Motion.
In 1984, Canadian businessmen Mike Lazaridis and Doug Fragan started tech company Research in Motion in Waterloo, Ontario. RIM's first success was a film editing tool called DigiSync that they won an Academy Award for in 1999. That award was a sign of big things to come for Lazaridis and Fragan. In 2002, they launched the game-changing BlackBerry smartphone, a device that became widely adopted almost immediately.
The concept of the smartphone really originates with the BlackBerry.
Texting, email, the internet, and more, all in one device.
This technology absolutely transforms human interactions at a fundamental level.
What we've had, thanks to telephony, is people who had no telecommunications going straight to cell phones and smartphones without ever going through the stages in between.
Look at developing countries where they learn from us in G8 countries and they realize we don't actually need those landlines. We can go straight to cell phone technology. We can go straight to the internet.
Canadian inventions that are literally making people's lives in the most distant places on the globe better every single moment. Without it, we would still be not Marshall McLuhan's global village, but a globe of villages. Everything we do today in terms of international relations, in terms of international commerce, telephony made that possible.
To be able to build companies, to be able to shape economies. So the impact of technology on a global level changes everything.
Dad? Dad? Hello?
But today, in the world without Canada, the phones stop working. That connectedness we take for granted is now gone.
What happens when your basic infrastructure that you take for granted fails?
Think about the impact on worldwide stock exchanges, international trade, nations on the brink of war. If telecommunications suddenly stopped working,
where in a matter of seconds, we can convey huge amounts of information.
That sense of connection, that sense of identity, all of that shifts without the technology.
Dad! Dad!
and today it's not just our networks of colleagues, family, and friends that are affected.
Hello?
The 911 service is probably something that Alexander Graham Bell never foresaw in Brantford, Ontario.
Imagine a world in which we didn't have a phone to be able to call emergency services.
Your sense of personal security would be, I think, shaken to the core.
Canada's impact on communications goes beyond talk and text.
Reginald Fessenden is the greatest Canadian you've never heard of.
On December 23, 1900, Fessenden from Bolton Est, Quebec, became the first person to transmit voice over radio waves. He secured hundreds of patents for his innovative work.
Radio is a terrific Canadian invention. We're responsible for letting the world hear itself.
Radio wave technology is behind some of the greatest advances in history.
From the beginning with radio, we got television, we got satellite communication, we got the World Wide Web, we got virtual reality.
Imagine if we never explored the potential of radio. All the things we could have lost. The power of radio, however, isn't limited to the technology itself. It's not just the medium, it's the message.
Words on a page are one thing, but when you bring those words to life through speech, they take on an entirely different meaning. Radio amplifies that force. It brings that power into your living room, into your car. It's an incredibly powerful tool for communicating and for inspiring.
Radio was the first time that voices could traverse the globe.
If you look back to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the radio was the source of direct transmissions around some of the biggest and most important events of the 20th century.
President Roosevelt's groundbreaking fireside chats in the 1930s and 40s helped the American public connect with him and understand his way of governing.
The notion of the president actually speaking to the people, unheard of before the advent of radio.
Being able to hear one voice booming out to the masses is a powerful and galvanizing thing.
In 1963, Martin Luther King led the March on Washington and spoke that great speech, "I Have a Dream."
King used the radio to spread his inspirational message beyond those listening to him that day in Washington.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Just thinking about that gives me goosebumps because his voice conveyed the emotion even though I wasn't physically there. Every intonation brought me along with that vision and empowered me to believe in that dream.
While political minds sought to transform society, other revolutions were underway, with radio as a pivotal tool.
It changes the entire history of music. Nobody would have heard of the Beatles in the United States if it wasn't for radio.
If you think about the Beatles having to schlep from one town to another, concert by concert, they would have been old and gray before, more than a few thousand people even knew who they were.
And the Beatles were on Canadian airwaves 1 year before they were released in the U.S. Canada became the first country across the pond to embrace the band. Canadians formed the first North American Beatles fan club. If Canadian Reginald Fessenden hadn't invented the radio, imagine how many artists may never have made it. No airplay, no widespread recognition. Radio helped get messages and music to the masses. But sometimes the most important radio transmissions, however, are between just a few key people.
I think very few people know that Canadians invented the walkie-talkie.
I got something.
Say again?
I got something.
In fact, it was 2 Canadians independently who invented the walkie-talkie. Donald Hings was working for a Canadian mining company. Alfred Gross was like your champion of amateur radio. When World War II broke out, the National Research Council of Canada went and picked up Donald Hings and got him to develop the radio for wartime purposes.
As we came out of the war, we realized that a lot of these technologies have incredibly powerful implications. And why not continue to develop them for everyday people and see what happens?
It's not an understatement to say tens of thousands of people's lives have been saved through operations that were coordinated by walkie-talkies.
We've become completely dependent on telephones, smartphones, and radio technologies.
I can't hear you.
Imagine the world today without them.
Take those away, those people are dead. That's over and out.
We gotta get out of here.
Without communications technologies, first responders aren't the only ones in peril in today's world without Canada. Emergency rooms are overrun from the sudden loss of some of Canada's incredible medical innovations. It's been just a few hours since some of Canada's greatest scientific contributions to the world have suddenly stopped working. Communications technologies were the first devastating blow. And now millions of lives are at risk as the world is left without game-changing Canadian medical breakthroughs.
Our emergency wards would be overflowing everywhere in the world without Canada.
Rio, Mumbai, Tokyo, cities everywhere are suddenly plagued by desperately sick patients.
Are you okay?
I don't
Having no way to communicate with emergency services, people are finding their own ways to the hospital. And diabetics need help fast.
Diabetes is a hormonal disorder. It's essentially our body not making enough insulin or not responding to insulin properly. When that happens, we end up with high blood sugar, and that is a very dangerous condition.
Without a critical Canadian scientific breakthrough, their bodies are failing.
Diabetes would be a fatal disease again.
In 1920, researchers Banting, Best, MacLeod, and Collop at the University of Toronto discovered a way to save the lives of diabetics worldwide.
Banting and Best were responsible for probably one of the biggest medical breakthroughs of the 20th century. The purification of insulin, the development of a treatment for diabetes.
This is a profound shift in our ability to understand and cope with a disease that was affecting millions of people.
To think that a Canadian innovation is something that is so intimately tied to their body and is with them every day and is giving them a life that they wouldn't have had before 1920 is remarkable.
Canada's first Nobel Prize was awarded for the discovery of insulin in 1923. Banting and MacLeod were awarded the prize, which they shared with Best and Collett.
Banting and Best gave us insulin, and it set the template for all subsequent drug therapies that were similar.
They demonstrated quite simply that if the problem was a missing hormone, you just put that hormone back and voila, treatment. A fantastic example is Addison's disease. JFK is probably the most famous Addison sufferer out there.
What would the world be like if Canadian breakthroughs in understanding hormonal disorders never happened?
He would never have been president. We might never have gone to the moon. A million different things would have happened in this world instead if it hadn't been for us setting a template.
Suddenly, diseases like Addison's were treatable, and that is all thanks to Banting and Best.
Worldwide, over 400 million people have diabetes. That's 1 in every 11 people. Before Frederick Banting discovered insulin, 100% of people with type 1 diabetes would not live for 10 years after they were diagnosed.
In the world without Canada, the insulin diabetics have been receiving isn't available anymore.
You suddenly deprive somebody of insulin. They're not going to die that hour. They're not going to die possibly that day. But in a week, they are going to be dead, dead, dead. It is an existential crisis.
Hospitals around the world are struggling to keep up. Things will get even worse as another game-changing Canadian invention stops working.
If suddenly everybody's pacemakers stopped working, that's, 3 million people who no longer have a regular heartbeat and could drop dead right away.
The Canadian innovation was to learn that electrical shocks could keep your heartbeat regular.
Toronto surgeons Wilfred Bigelow and John Callahan came up with the idea for the pacemaker during an operation when a patient's heart stopped beating.
As a last-ditch measure, Bigelow has an electric probe in his hand, and he says, I'm just going to try this, applies the electric pulse to the heart, and it starts again. It starts beating. It's remarkable.
Bigelow and Callahan teamed up with electrical engineer John Hopps of the National Research Council in Ottawa to design what became the world's first external pacemaker.
The first one that Callahan, Hopps, and Bigelow invented was, the size of a radio, and it was placed outside the body.
In the years following their invention, many inventors have continued to refine the pacemaker.
You have a lot of people out there who depend on this electrical pulse for their life.
All of a sudden, it's not just your life that matters. Hundreds or even thousands of other lives can be affected by that.
You're driving a car when that happens, and you are a lethal weapon. You're as dangerous as a loaded gun.
One of the neatest aspects of this story is that Hopps, who invented the pacemaker, ultimately had one implanted himself.
So his own invention saved his life later on.
Most scientists hope for one great moment in their life. Bigelow and Callahan had 2. Their first big innovation was open heart surgery. They had been doing some research on hypothermia and realized that when bodies get cold, circulation and all the other organ systems sort of slow down.
This was the key breakthrough. Slowing the blood circulating through the body by cooling the patient allowed doctors to open the chest to repair the heart for the first time in history. Callahan later moved to Edmonton, Alberta, and performed Canada's first open heart surgery in 1956.
Canada punches well above its weight in matters of science and technology and medicine, and always has.
A number of Canada's great medical minds have been women.
There were women for us to look up to going back to the mid-1800s, and that's an incredible source of inspiration. Women like Maud Abbott, who really paved the way for other women in the field.
Abbott from Saint-André d'Argenteuil, Quebec, became one of the world's leading experts on congenital heart disease. 50 years later, women like Sylvia Federick of Saskatchewan were helping to change the outlook for those with cancer. Federick worked with one of the Canadian groups developing radiation therapy known as the Cobalt-60 bomb.
Sylvia Federick was really forward-thinking. She was a medical physicist who was the first person to actually get doses of Cobalt-60 into patients. She was the one that turned it from an idea into a treatment.
Radiation therapies like those pioneered in Canada are still primary methods used to fight cancer.
There is no doubt that the fight against it is led with Canadian materials and Canadian techniques.
While teams were developing radiation treatments for cancer, Canadian Wilder Penfield was studying our most complex and mysterious organ.
Nurse.
His work was integral to today's understanding of the brain and its complexity. Without Penfield's work, we'd have lost our most successful treatment for epilepsy. Thousands of people around the world would be again on a daily basis living with crippling seizures.
In today's world without Canada, Penfield's revolutionary brain mapping work is lost. How big of an impact would this have around the planet? Right now, an estimated 50 million people worldwide currently live with epilepsy. Another 2.4 million are diagnosed each year.
It's not just Penfield's contribution to epilepsy treatment that's so important, too. If we were to have lost all of his other work, this brain mapping research that he did, it would set neurology back by, 100 years.
Treatments for depression, treatments for neuromuscular disorders like Parkinson's, treatments ultimately for things like Alzheimer's, memory loss, all of those things are being worked on now. That's the direct linear descendant of the work that Wilder Penfield did.
We've only touched the surface of Canada's impact in medicine, and we've affected the lives of millions in the world without Canada. As Canadian contributions in engineering stop working, our safety will be put at risk. It's a day unlike any other, a day when we envision the world without Canada, a place where key contributions to communications and medicine have suddenly stopped working. The resurgence of diabetes and fatal heart conditions has left hospitals worldwide reeling. As some of Canada's safety and security technologies stop working, things aren't getting any better.
Whether it's a surveillance-related activity looking for trouble before it happens, or if a crime's being committed, taking a lasting visual record of that we can then use in our search for a suspect or in prosecution.
One transformative Canadian innovation has helped define a new era of communication and helped to keep people safe around the world. A tiny chip called the CCD. The CCD, or charge-coupled device, allows us to capture light and turn it into electrical charges. It allows us to digitize what we see.
At Bell Labs, Canadian Willard Boyle was working with his colleague George Smith on a way to improve computer memory. But what they actually found was a device that could turn light into an electrical signal.
The CCD chip changed photography. There's no doubt about it.
Boyle, a native of Nova Scotia, won a Nobel Prize in 2009 for his work and was declared father of the digital eye. It's a tiny creation that sparked a worldwide revolution.
So there are literally hundreds of possibilities for the use of the CCD in communications in the future.
The invention of the CCD basically kicked off the digital age. Everything you watch on television, everything you look at on your phone, on the internet, all of this came from the invention of the CCD.
The beautiful photos we've had of the universe through the Hubble Space Telescope are charge-coupled device photos. What opened up the universe to us was this technology.
Take a second to think about the impact the CCD has had on the way we communicate.
Suddenly photography moves into a brand new sphere.
You have a generation for whom the camera is probably the single most important piece of technology, the one that dictates how they live. This selfie, Instagram, and Snapchat. These are entirely new modes of communication.
If you haven't posted a picture, it didn't really happen. If it's not on Facebook, nobody heard about it. My whole mental construct of my world is now seen through images that I can shade, I can change, I can retouch, and create other things.
Around 1 trillion digital photos are taken on phone cameras alone each year. If you looked at each one for a second continuously, it would take you over 30,000 years.
There's been no such seismic shift in human relations ever as powerful as the one the CCD technology made possible.
But it's not just about documenting the world around us. This indispensable technology keeps us safe, too.
It's a hugely valuable security tool.
In the world without Canada, we lose this digital security. Imagine what it would be like to lose the connections that we've come to depend on.
We can't watch all of the places that need to be watched at the same time. And so this technology stands in for the guards on the tower, if you like.
One recent incident highlighted the value of CCTV cameras for security. On April 15th, 2013, 2 homemade bombs exploded during the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed. More than 260 others were hurt. In the charged days following the blasts, CCTV footage identified the 2 bombers.
Without that technology, we never would have found the people responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing.
And without CCD security footage, things could have been even worse. The brothers planned to make their next target New York, to bomb Times Square.
We get, through these imaging systems, the ability to save human lives.
What could go wrong today in the world without Canada if police suddenly can't target criminals? Canada's contribution to security extends beyond the CCD, making the world without a volatile place.
Canadian technology from the NRC, the National Research Council of Canada, is used worldwide in detecting explosives before they go off.
NRC researcher Lauren Elias has been working on devices that could chemically detect harmful vapors. In the mid-1980s, the Canadian government asked Elias to develop the explosive vapor detector.
It is life-saving, and it's Canadian.
The EVD became commonplace in Canadian airports, and the technology was adapted worldwide. In the air, Canadian mines have made significant advances as well.
One of the first innovations that Canadians bring to the table in aircraft design is something called the variable pitch propeller.
They allow a plane and pilot to change speeds, much like a manual transmission in a car.
In 1927, in the peace between the 2 world wars, Wallace Turnbull, a Canadian, invented the variable pitch propeller.
Turnbull, a New Brunswick engineer, developed a propeller that was favored by pilots in World War II.
To this day, that Canadian invention, the variable pitch propeller, is used on most small aircraft.
Without a working propeller, these planes won't stay in the air for long. And planes aren't the only vehicles affected. On the other side of the planet, travel isn't much safer today in the world without Canada. Variable pitch propellers are also found on ships. On the open ocean, cargo vessels are now adrift. And without vital communications technologies, ships and planes around the world are on their own.
You're alone on a stormy sea, and there's nobody that's coming to help you.
A world without some of Canada's most revolutionary innovations is a dark place. And things are about to get much darker. The world is a strange and foreboding place, now that some of Canada's key breakthroughs in science and technology have stopped working. The loss of yet another innovation won't help matters.
It goes without saying the world would be a darker place without electric light.
We live safe lives, we live much more productive lives than we ever did before.
A pair of Canadian inventors came up with one of the world's first light bulb designs. In 1873, medical student Henry Woodward and his neighbor Matthew Evans were playing around with a battery and an induction coil in their home lab.
They came up with the idea for a light bulb when they saw a spark and realized how bright it was. The idea of using carbon in the filament and the idea of taking the air out of the chamber were the two things that really set them apart from other inventors at the time.
But their light bulb didn't take off. In fact, they were mocked for creating a useless product. But another inventor and businessman took notice.
They patented their idea in both Canada and the United States, which caught the interest of Thomas Edison, who was trying to develop a light bulb of his own. He ended up buying their patent for $5,000.
Canada has another connection to the light bulb. Edison's father was from Nova Scotia.
And without Canada, there's no Thomas Edison and none of the inventions he came up with, including the electric light bulb.
While the bulb gained ground on city streets and in buildings, another light source was used for car and mining headlamps. In 1892, Thomas Wilson from Princeton, Ontario, made the key discovery.
Thomas Wilson developed a way of manufacturing acetylene gas.
Acetylene burns a bright white and worked well to illuminate early roads and tunnels. At the beginning of the 20th century, acetylene gas became the primary means of welding metals like I-beams.
This is a technology that made possible the vertical growth across the planet of architecture and buildings.
Acetylene lighting fell out of favor, and eventually the light bulb took over every aspect of illumination. The world began to transform.
The light bulb was the gateway to the modern era. Where there's light, there must be electricity. So factories, hospitals, homes that wanted light bulbs needed electricity and were suddenly wired and had the potential to be so much more.
If there hadn't been that thing that everybody could see the utility of, we never would have wired the world. The very metaphor of an idea is the light bulb. It was such a game changer that it's become symbolic of the very notion of innovation.
In the world without Canada, light bulbs stopped working.
A world without light is a dangerous place.
You are more suspicious. You are more cautious. You're perhaps even a tad paranoid about what may lurk in the shadows.
Before electric light, dark city streets worldwide were considered incredibly dangerous. Evil spirits lurked in the dark. But there were real enemies too.
Murder used to be rampant on the dark streets. The world was a place of thieves and cutthroats.
Munich's murder rate is thought to have been 5 times higher before the advent of the light bulb. Today, under the cover of darkness, we seem to easily revisit our lurid roots.
We've all seen the stories of what happens during, say, accidental blackouts when a city loses its power. Suddenly there's people breaking windows and stealing things.
An infamous example took place in New York City in 1977. After lightning knocked out power to the city, looters ran wild. 1,600 stores were ransacked. Almost 4,000 people were arrested. 1,000 fires were set. In the world without Canada and working electric light, fire becomes something we rely on once again for light and heat.
Prior to electric lights, we relied on oil or gas lamps or actual open flame to provide illumination at night.
This was something that was dangerous. If a lamp fell over, your house could go up in flames.
History is riven with examples of fires that went out of control.
Fires sparked by lamps or candles have ravaged cities worldwide. London lit up in 1666, Copenhagen in 1728, New York in 1845, and Chicago's Great Fire was claimed to have been started by a cow that kicked over a lantern.
This is what we lived with before the light bulb.
We are rightly nervous about being around fire.
In the world without Canada, sudden darkness has sparked disasters. When Canada's contributions to power stop working, we'll be even more vulnerable. It's been less than a day since Canada's key contributions to science and technology have suddenly stopped working. The loss of communications and medical advances have left the world reeling. Things aren't looking up either as some of Canada's engineering achievements shut down. During the 1940s, Canada became a leader in radioactive technologies, becoming the second nation ever to show that nuclear reactions could be harnessed safely for clean power. In the 1960s, Canadian researchers developed the CANDU nuclear reactor.
Canadian deuterium uranium, a kind of nuclear power generating plant that is safe and efficient. It's installed all over the world.
Parts of China, South Korea, Argentina, and India rely on the CANDU for electricity.
The reality is, CANDU reactors around the globe are giving countries that would not have clean or safe sources of energy that very thing.
The same radioactive elements in nuclear reactors worldwide are those helping treat cancer. Remember the Canadian innovation, cobalt-60?
This is an isotope that's sort of a byproduct of nuclear reactors. So the same facilities that are generating power for people are creating, as a byproduct, this unusual little radioactive isotope.
The CANDU reactor wasn't Canada's only breakthrough in powering the world.
Not a lot of people know this, but alkaline batteries are a Canadian invention. Louis Urey, working at the Eveready Battery Company, he came up with an alkaline battery, a new type of battery that had never been seen before.
The first Eveready alkaline batteries hit shelves in 1958. Urey, born in Pontypool, Ontario, earned more than 50 patents during his lifetime, including some for the development of the lithium-ion battery. Before later successes, Urey had to uniquely prove his alkaline battery design was superior.
When he went and talked to the executives of the company, he had two toy cars that he placed on the floor. One had his new design and one had an old battery. His new battery kept the car going 2 or 3 times as long as the old battery did.
The possibilities for kids' toys skyrocketed. Around the same time, another innovator began marketing her invention for children, something that relied only on the power of 2 little legs. In 1910, Olivia Poole created a modified version of a baby-soothing device she remembered from her youth. Her Ojibwe family members, while tending the fields, used to securely suspend their baby cradles from tree limbs. The bouncing of the limbs soothed and entertained the infants. Poole named her version the Jolly Jumper, and after using it with her 7 children and many grandchildren, decided to patent the design and market it for families worldwide. Canadian innovation in child well-being doesn't stop there. In 1930, researchers Frederick Tisdall, Theodore Drake, and Alan Brown at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto revolutionized child nutrition.
One of the biggest problems of the early 20th century was infant malnutrition and mortality rate.
In 1920, in Canada alone, 1 in 7 children never reached 5 years of age. Tisdall, Drake, and Brown responded with Pablum.
Pablum was really the first nutritional food designed to give babies, give kids everything they needed.
Nutritional deficiencies dropped from 62 to 17% after Pablum was invented.
Early nutrition means better health outcomes later in life, whether it's childhood infectious diseases or anything from autoimmune disorders to depression.
The impact of Pablum goes beyond childhood nutrition alone.
Because the royalties for the Pablum patent were held by Sick Kids Hospital for the next 25 years, millions of dollars went into funding other research at Sick Kids.
Today, Sick Kids is one of the world's leading pediatric hospitals. Around the world, at the culmination of our day without Canada, we can truly begin to see the impact key Canadian minds have had.
there wouldn't be a person on Earth who wasn't affected.
If some of Canada's key impacts in communications, medicine, engineering, and power stop working, the world without Canada is an unimaginable place.
A world without Canada really wouldn't be much of a world at all.
Canadian science and technology breakthroughs and game-changing innovations suddenly stopped working over the course of one devastating day.
Without the incredible impact that Canada has had on technology, we would be living in a completely different world.
But happily, we don't have to live there.
The last 150 years and beyond, Canada has contributed far more than anyone realizes to the world.
From Canada's advancements in chemistry and engineering to medical breakthroughs and communication technologies.
If you look at any of these innovations independently, they're fantastic. They're great in their own right. But when you put them together, they're much greater than the sum of their parts. They impact the entire world.
Our medical contributions are and continue to be some of the most impactful.
Canada's actually been quite an innovator in the field of infectious diseases and public health. The first to sequence the SARS genome, really decode how this virus worked. And we can thank Winnipeg for some of the treatments that we now have that were tested in this last Ebola outbreak. Those came from Canadian researchers. It's not just innovations and inventions that Canada brings to the medical stage, it's people. We have produced some of the brightest and best medical minds of the last 150 years. The very first Director General of the WHO was a Canadian.
Major General Brock Chisholm from Oakville, Ontario, headed the WHO from 1948 to 1953, and even proposed the eventual name, the World Health Organization. Canadian contributions to medicine show no signs of stopping. From our early work in radiation therapies, we've come to be world leaders in the treatment of cancer. From the isolation of insulin, Canadian teams have been working on ways to fully cure diabetes.
Toast for the lady.
Yeah, Dad.
Advances in communication technology will also continue to knit the world together.
Canada is a world leader in quantum computing, which is the cutting edge of computing technology.
Canada is home to major players in the development of quantum computing.
Mike Lazaridis, who was co-founder of Research in Motion, RIM, endowed the Institute for Quantum Computing in Waterloo. D-Wave Computing in British Columbia is the only commercial operation on the planet shipping quantum computers, and their clients include Google and NASA.
Canadian technology is also vital to our search for life beyond.
We've been exploring the solar system and indeed the universe beyond, thanks to charge-coupled devices.
A large telescope called the LSST is being built that will be able to capture images with a resolution of 3.2 gigapixels. That's 64 times higher resolution than the best digital camera on today's market. Canada is truly a place of incredible minds and innovations, past and future.
Le Canada est un pays incroyable. Canada is an incredible country.
I am definitely proud to be Canadian. I'm proud that we can contribute so much to the world.
We aren't just wonderful landscapes. We are technologists, engineers, scientists who have remade so many fundamental technologies and are going to continue to do so well into the future.
We've got a history of 150 years of amazing innovation, and if we look forward to the next 150 years, the possibilities are endless.
Whatever the future brings, Canadian science and technology will be front and center.